All right, let's talk about the Cataclysm. So I had very high hopes for this game, and no game does exactly what you expected of it when you're thinking about it ahead of time. This game didn't exactly meet my hopes, which were kind of along the lines of, well, a more expanded Hitler's War, or a richer, deeper kind of Days of Decision or something. This is its own beast, and it's one hell of an interesting beast when it comes down to it. One thing right off the bat that may totally make some people completely uninterested in it is this will not ever probably give you World War II. It will give you, sometimes if you follow the right, the same strategies as historically happened, something that vaguely feels like World War II, but it's so, the premise is that actually, the events that caused World War II to happen the way that it did are, a bunch of fairly low odds things strung together. And that this game gives you the opportunity to explore that space, but you're not going to get that series of low odds events happening in anywhere near the same order, probably. It gives you the historical starting point and a lot of variance coming off of that, with a three ideology struggle for control of the world, and a victory point system that might actually encourage a World War II-ish behavior in some ways. For example, the way the board is set up, etc. It's very unlikely that you're going to see an Allied Soviet war instead of the Axis being kind of the center of aggression in the world. But it is possible that the Allies would want to go to war with the Soviets rather than the Axis. It's just harder for them to do so. What we saw in the gameplay that I had was the Soviets and the Allies kind of wanted to get at each other, but they couldn't do so, until they got the Axis cleared out of the way. Anyway. This may well be a masterpiece. It's certainly going to go into more printings. There's no question of that, which is a good thing because the components in this printing are a little weak. In particular, the paper maps are very, very thin and these glossy little guys. And this is one of the few games that I think I'm interested in enough that I might spring for an upgrade if GMT makes a hard map available. I think the game deserves a hard map, and there's it's not a big map, so but it's two maps, and that may be a little rough for GMT to do as hard maps. They're small, but kind of flimsy. Well, if we're talking about components, let's talk about the rest of them. This you get a lot of examples and stuff on the backs of player aids, which you can photocopy or whatever if you need them, and you need to be able to see the player aid at the same time. You also have historical information on the backs of the per country things. Boy, these remind me of Third Reich, don't they? So the stock is pretty good on the player aids. You have 3 of these suckers. This is where the money went instead of on the map board, right? You got three of these, one for each player, and they contain most of the rules in an easier to find, easier to access manner than the rulebook does. But they don't contain everything, and there's a lot of special rules. A lot of them are referenced in here. I'm never sure which is better to approach. I feel like probably relying more on these is better, but I tend to rely more on the rulebook, and it causes problems. Another one, crisis tables, just some random events that happen. one of these guys for each nationality, and these cover your mobilization level, your commitment level. Mobilization is one of the commitment levels, as well as some boxes. You know, you hold your force pool here, you got your available markers, which is kind of like force pool, and then you got the stuff that you're ready to place on the board. Each of the 3 ideologies has its own special power sheet, which has a secret example or something on the back in each case, not to waste space. Not thrilled with dice. Sometimes GMT puts really cool dice in these. I don't know. I don't really like these. But you do need 3 dice for each. You need at least 6 dice to play the game. And they need to be 2 different colors, pretty much. You could have people of all different sizes. But they give you 9, 1 for each ideology. And there's not really need for that, but it kind of allows you to hold your own dice all the time. Bunch of wooden cubes. These are pretty much control markers. I know some people have kind of complained, what fucking wooden cubes doing on this? It makes it more of a Euro. Well, there are some aspects of this game that are kind of Euro-y, but the wooden cubes really are not. What they do that I kind of like is they help pop out the most important thing in terms of information on the board. The negative to them is some of the board spaces, especially in China, are a little small. They take up a fair amount of space, and they kind of cast a shadow on other pieces, so it's kind of hard to see maybe what the military situation is there. But the political situation of those cubes really does kind of pop out who owns what in a better way than maybe counters would. So I wouldn't grouse too much about them. The counters, each country has a significant pool of counters available to it. Probably a little more than they would use in any strategy that they're going to have, but that gives you a flexibility to put out different types of forces for different types of political situations or grand strategic plans in the game. And the counters are quite nice, actually. For the rulebook, full color, not too glossy, makes me happy. It doesn't throw a nasty glare even with my lights, which, compare that to like Compass. Compass games, their rulebooks are always way too glossy. There's one thing that I kind of like about GMT is they seem to have gone with a good stock of paper for the rulebooks. It's not quite, your gamer's quality paper, but it works for me, I'm fussy, but I'm not ridiculous. The problem with the rulebook that I have, I don't know if it can be fixed. I find the rules difficult to understand at times and very difficult to find things. But that's because the game is full of special cases. And that's just part of the design, really. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit as to why that's kind of necessary and why it's a good and a bad thing in this particular game. But I did find the rules not a great reference. There's an index over here in the playbook, which contains a great deal of information. It doesn't contain everything you want. Actually, it's more of a glossary. They put it as glossary index. I would prefer an index that threw me into the rules and told me, here's where you want to go for this. Because this can't be complete as a glossary, but it could have been more complete as an index. There's some things that I really want a rules reference for. I go look in there and I find nothing. And then I go paging through the rules. Or I never even look in there because I learned my lesson. It doesn't have everything, right? It's the same issue with the play aids. If they don't have everything, does that mean they're horrible? No, but they have enough stuff that things that they're missing could be things that you forget about if you keep them. Now, of course, you're going to forget about things anyway until you become really, really competent at this game. And so far, that's eluded me. This was 5 plays and still making mistakes. 3 of them were smaller scenarios. But it is a hard, all those special rules and everything, it's a hard concept to get your head around. The play aid the playbook contains a rather large playthrough of a good part of one of the scenarios, the Days of Decision scenario, which is kind of an interesting one. It sets you up kind of an origins of World War II era, you know. Germany hasn't started its expansions. Most of the countries are still free, and there's a lot to shake up. And the war can start during that, but you're not gonna probably play to completion of the war there. There's a bunch of scenarios, some of them smaller, some of them larger. One of the things I noted in the wrap was they all start you at peace. You got to figure out when and how to get to war, and that's really what the game is about. The game is about engineering the war you want, and even in the small scenarios, even in the the Barbarossa, which is the Great Patriotic War. You know where it's going. You know what you got to do in general, but it still gives you a little bit of leeway to set things up a little different, to do some politics beforehand, to get your situation where you want it in order to move forward. And that makes it makes for a different game, and that's one of the things. This game is a different beast from almost anything else I've seen. I guess the closest it comes to is Days of Decision. But Days of Decision has that I've seen. Days of Decision has this horrible combat system. And it's kind of a mess in terms of the political situation and everything. Everything in here works. The mechanisms that are used in the game work well enough. If you read the rules carefully, if you'll find an answer to everything you have. I'm not good at reading rules carefully, so I found some things that felt ambiguous at times, but I was able to nail down what the answers were eventually. What else can we say? Well, my first reaction to it when I started playing it was, what the fuck do I do? And I piddled around with it and started playing that Days of Decision scenario, not the one out of the not the playthrough in the playbook, but my own version of it. And I just couldn't come up with any kind of plan, any kind of idea. And it really took me going through those first 3 introductory scenarios to start to come up with, okay, here's what I would try to do. Then when faced with the actual beast, twice playing the Grand Campaign game, I've been left with not quite that, I have no idea what to do, but I have no idea how to get to what I want to do. In particular, the hardest thing in the game that I found, or one of the hardest, is trying to engineer the war itself to start. Getting yourself into the position where you can declare war properly. Now, for the Axis, that isn't a problem. They can just roll into anything. So they can start the war that they want when they want it. Unfortunately, in my game, although I intended for the European Axis to be more aggressive than they were, things didn't turn out that way, and they ended up playing a very, very peaceful existence. Which is interesting, and it did showcase something, which is that they can't get away with that. They can score up, they can start racking up victory points, but the game's not going to end in time, probably. Even with an incompetent like me trying to play the Allies and get the war going. The Allies have a hard time starting a war. So do the Russians, for that matter. They're not really willing to invade things willy-nilly, as it were. So they kind of have to build themselves up, mobilizing, get their commitment up high enough, maybe get their alliances in row so they're not committing suicide, and then finally, hey, enough is enough, we're going in. You're not going to see certain scenarios that you can see in some historical World War II prelude situations. Like, you're not going to see the French march in and say "niet" to the Germans militarizing the Rhineland. To some extent, that kind of disturbs me. A more aggressive France, although completely ahistorical, is one of those interesting questions. What would have happened if France had closed the door there? Politically, that could have caused some really interesting reshuffles. You might have seen Britain falling away from France on that, even though France had every right to go in there. You certainly would have seen U.S. Less interested in supporting. So that's the kind of question you're not going to answer here. You're going to get an answer that, or the kind of questions that you get to answer here are of a very different nature. You have a France that's very pathetic and isn't going to do anything aggressive. Now, there's one scenario that makes France more potent. It also makes them fascists, and replaces Italy, makes Italy a democracy, which seems kind of like a gratuitous what if that is less likely than the one I was postulating. You could probably tweak around with the game and try to make something where you had a more aggressive France trying to slam the door, but you'd have to really play with the scenario. It's not as open to sandboxing in that sense as like Days of Decision is. When you get down to the game, as you're setting up your political, and grand strategy and trying to arrange for what's going to happen, what's kind of shocking is how fast, once the war starts, that it just is over. And one of the things with that is, the game turns are 2 years each. World War II is pretty much a 4-year war. Pretty much. Okay, you can argue it stretches 6, fine. Still, that's a third of the game turns available to you maximum, right? Maybe half the game, if you look at 39 to 44, that's 3 turns there. You don't really get into the global war until you get into here historically. And the game is over by here, right? So, most of the game, in terms of turns, is about that jockeying. And then in the limited war position, you're still trying to arrange things via the Axis. You're trying to arrange so you can take the Soviets out while you deal with taking France out or whatever. Speaking of which, taking France out is harder. The historical was very, very easy, right? And most of the games that try to represent the historical situation make it fairly easy to plow through France, pretty much no matter what you do. Even if you're playing Days of Decision with Whiff, you generally see France fall. They don't have a lot of options to make themselves really tough. It's not like they really do have all that many more options here, but if you give them too much time, they can kind of entrench themselves. If you don't build up the German army strong enough, it may not be able to face the French. In fact, here we had an offensive French army marching in and capturing a good chunk of Germany. But that was helped by the threat of a Russian army sitting on the East Front, just saying, I'm not sure I want to go first here, One of us has to. But there's a lot of opportunity for seeing different things that happen. It's just, you're not going to be able to tailor it to some of the questions that you want. Largely that's because there's so much randomness in play. I mean, I guess it's possible that you could just declare, you could start mobilizing with France, get an early jump with that 1 in 6 chance that you have of, doing anything political with France, and then keep going. One of the things that concerned me early on in the game, in fact, sticking with France here, was the fact that France never gets better at political actions. Doesn't matter if you caused Italy and Germany to surrender, you're still a really shitty country when it comes to trying to do the political things, maintain your stability, etc. You're just not ready for this war. You're not ready for any kind of political conflict even. You're not able to do much. The best you can do is actually do military, because that, once you're geared up for that doesn't actually require a lot of political will. But the problem is, keeping your country floating in public opinion does require political will. And that can be hard to maintain when you've got shitty die rolls or a shitty a shitty amount of dice to roll. All right. I guess let's talk a little bit about some of the systems and such and how they feel. I'm gonna do this off the plane because hey, maybe I'll learn something exciting. So one of the key factors in the game, early in the game, you have these political flags essentially, and you get these every turn, but then you, except for the Allies under status quo, but anyway, and the Russians under certain of their political stances. The Axis always gets them, but in general, you get flags every turn, and they're going to be things that you can do to do political stuff within your own country, like mobilizing, upgrading your will to even be fighting the war through propaganda, declaring war, doing diplomacy, and some of that diplomacy is done on other players, like trying to create an alliance with another player or trying to pressure them into giving them a flag so they can do stuff. These are the most important thing that you have early in the game, until really the war starts heating up, and then you're much more focused on the military side of things. You get production. Production's handled through simple numbers. Basically, you have a number of production sites. You maybe multiply that number by up to 3, and you're probably going to have like less than, well, you're always going to have like less than 10 production in a turn. And those production points, well, okay, you're going to have less than 10 production sites. The US has like 7 production sites. Once they're up to global war, they have like 21 points. But compare this to the WIF or Third Reich or something like that, where you're dealing with big numbers and then paying different amounts for each unit. Here you're largely paying 1 per unit. A couple exceptions or a couple of 2-point things. Primarily fleets cost 2, and upgrading a military unit to the stronger version of that unit costs 2. Okay. You build your units. Most of them are going to go into, it's back there, I'm not going to grab it, a little cup, which you're going to pull them from. You have the opportunity, though, to reserve 1 piece, a flag, an offensive, a unit, whatever. 1 piece that's going to allow you to trump in and do things exciting. Now, usually you're reserving something that you want to use early in the turn, but you might also be reserving a resource because you can't really, you have like an odd resource that you can't spend, and you're like, well, I'd rather have that resource next turn than have the opportunity to trump in with an action. You've got to hold it there your entire turn, though, so it's got a significant opportunity cost. Then you know, people have the opportunity to trump in. There's some limitations to that, and do whatever is on that counter. Otherwise, you're going to draw counters from the chip gun. And there's some random event counters in there too, including civil war, crises that cause true random events, etc. You basically pull those chits out, and when you get the offensives, those give you an opportunity to do something military on the board. Now, offensives they're not hard to get early in the game, but they're not very useful. So you generally aren't picking them up. They have a high cost, which is you can trade a resource in for an offensive. But once you're belligerent, you start getting offensives each turn. And also, once you go, as you move into mobilization or total war, you get a big pile of offensives that gives you this interesting dynamic where you can like sort of start a lot of fights, but it can also put you in a stupid position. So that's really geared to give a big advantage to the Axis. They're able to start the fights that they want. The Allies have to arrange for their offensives to come out at a time when they're capable of declaring war. So they got to be really careful about what they're doing. Otherwise, they end up wasting a bunch of chits, which generally happens for me. You mobilize, you get a pile of offensives, and look, I'm still not at war, you know. And then the final thing in the sequence of play is eventually the crisis chits are going to come up, all four of them come up, and the turn's going to perhaps end. And it ends if nobody has much left to do. And that's kind of a variable moving target. But if you have a lot of chits still in the cup, you're not going to see the turn end, right? So you're not going to get screwed out of your turn by a bad set of those crisis chits. You're going to get most of your actions out of the cup before there's end of turn. And the actions that you still have in your cup come back to you. They go in your production box. So you're going to be able to throw them in next turn. You don't lose those in any sense. But you do lose the opportunity of getting them played that turn, which is kind of a big deal. So you don't want to be left. So it's an important thing that you're not left with a bunch of chips at the end of the turn. Flags, like I said, you get some at the beginning of your turn, or at the beginning of any given turn, because everybody kind of does this together. But you also get them from people poking you. People do things that annoy you. That could be declaring war on you, but it could also be things like just, invading a country that you have an interest in, invading, or successfully doing diplomacy against a country that you have an interest in. And interests are defined kind of geographically. There's no set interests, but there is a set starting position. So, for example, if England has a base, Gibraltar, in Spain, they have an interest in Spain. You do anything in Spain, you're going to provoke England. And that concept of interests and provocation, kind of like the casus belli over in Pax Britannica. But the bonus of it is you get something good when you're provoked. You don't just get the right to declare war or something. You get something, a flag, and now you can do something with that. You can do something politically with it. Your stability, big deal here. So I've always liked games that handle kind of a national morale or something like that. This one has a nice mechanism for that. It degrades. Once you go to a war footing, it just degrades automatically. And now you have to start spending your flags to keep your stability up. You may find that impossible if you're France, for example. You may collapse. On the other hand, with other countries, it's just sort of a limitation. It means that they're going to have a harder time using their flags for diplomacy or for increasing their commitment or something like that, because they've got to worry about keeping their stability up. Now, at the beginning of the game, you start usually in civilian production, which gives you a bonus. You don't decrease automatically. So you don't have to worry about using your flags that way, but you really do want to start increasing your commitment pretty early. Combat itself is a fairly simple system that all works very much the same. Basically, you're going to be rolling at heart 2 dice against 2 dice. There are modifiers to the number of dice you have, modifiers to the die roll you have. You roll the dice, and you take your highest die and compare it to your opponent's highest die, putting modifiers in play. If you beat them, you do damage to them. If you beat them by multiples, you do multiple levels of damage to them. Very, very simple system. Seems to work pretty well. It doesn't seem to create craziness like, like an Axis and Allies type thing where you're just, or Risk, where you're just pushing huge hordes of pieces around. In fact, you're not allowed to. You've got stacking limitations, which in general are 2 pieces per land area, 1 piece per sea area, and one piece of each type. So you can have like 1 fleet unit, 1 air unit in the area, and 1 ground unit if ground units are allowed to be there. As the game progresses and your commitment level goes up, each of your offensive markers becomes more and more valuable. They start off unable to do anything, but eventually they move up to where they can produce one military action, and then they move all the way up to 3 military actions. And that can allow you to, shoot across quite a bit of the map, 3 spaces. I mean, if you're looking at Russia coming from Poland, 1, 2, 3, I can capture Moscow off one offensive if things are pretty clear, right? But it's unlikely that things are going to be that clear. So you have some other opportunities. One that I really like is that you can trade some of those military actions to augment and give yourself a +1 to your highest die roll. And you can do that multiple times. So you can attack an area and give yourself +2 with your 3 actions off an operations chip, which is pretty cool. 3 operations off an offensive chip. Let's get the terminology better. We're not going to get it precise, no matter what. Oh yeah, so the stability, let's go to that. Well, it drops into a certain box called collapse error, and bad things happen, not surprisingly. One of them is, well, first of all, if you've reached mobilization or higher, which is, if you manage to do this before hitting mobilization, which I did, I don't know if it happened in this game, you're probably doing something very, very weird and very wrong. But if you hit it after, once you reach mobilization, you fall into exhaustion, and you're never, you're limited pretty much to the mobilization level, but with worse stability checks, the total war stability check penalty, which is bad. It's a fairly simple system. Basically, something bad happens, you roll dice equal to your effectiveness. If you get a 5 or a 6, which is generally the success roll, you have to get 5s and 6s to succeed on non-military actions, to do things politically. Well, the same kind of thing happens with this, the stability checks. If you don't get a 5 or 6, your stability drops down. It's possible it could drop more than once in the home front counter under wartime conditions, but if it drops down to the collapse, you check to see if you surrender, which is also a die roll modified by your situation. If you surrender, you're just out of the game, and that particular power is not in play anymore. It's probably at negative victory points, and those just remain there. Whatever. If, on the other hand, you don't surrender, you're weakened. In general, the exhaustion effect is the worst part. For the Germans, they lose their Knight of the Long Knives, which gives them a bonus. One of the many special rules in the game, they're necessary to give it the flavor and the historical accuracy, and they're really not any more than you have in other grand strategic World War II games. However, there are a much higher proportion of this game's rules, which is to say that the basic systems for this game are fairly lightweight. But the special rules are are proportionally a large part of that rules. So it feels like you're learning a fairly light game. Now, to be honest, I probably make as many mistakes in a game of Whiff, missing the special rules, as I do in this. However, they have a bigger effect here, I think, overall. Hard to tell. Also, because of the way that they are, the whole game, and I mentioned this a while back, the Euro-ish aspect to it, the whole game has a sort of abstractness to it. And it's very hard to kind of grasp X leading to Y or whatever, you're not really thinking, oh, geez, the Germans should really have two flags. In the same way that you'd be thinking, shouldn't oil be a factor? You know, something like that in a game like Whiff. So you're left with this sort of, many of these special rules represent something, but they don't represent it in a way that's intuitive and that you would just think of patching onto the game. It's a very carefully crafted game, and there's a problem with that. This is the same issue that the Complex Euros, that High Frontier, that John Company, a lot of games that have been playing have to affect them, which is, it's not absolutely clear what the hell you should do. Remember, my first impression to them, what the fuck? Am I looking at... And it's this matter of obscurantism. It's not immediately obvious what things you need to do to get from point A to point B. Now in this game, like in some of the others, it's not clear what point B should be, where you should be aiming. High Frontier has this too. And I kind of look at this as sort of like, okay, take Days of Decision and High Frontier, mash them together, and this is what you get. You know kind of what you want to do. You want to dominate the world, right? That makes sense. You want to go explore planets and stuff. But it's very, very hard to be sure and to understand the broad intermediate steps for strategy, where you want to aim to get to where you want to, the victory conditions are simple enough, but how to get to those isn't clear. And then when it comes down to actually mechanistically causing them, it's hard. It's hard. Now, I actually think the Axis is probably easier to play because you can start a war whenever you want, Of course, when you're playing friendly Hitler or whatever, you're really putting a burden on the Allies and forcing them to work hard. But even with incompetent Allies, that didn't hold up very well. It looked like the Axis as a whole was going to go under. And that's an issue now. Anyway, I'm very impressed with this, although it saddens me, as do a few other games, that I'm never going to have the time to devote to it. I think I could get a lot off of this. It doesn't strike me, so like the Coin series, which was an exciting system and everything, I'm not left with the feeling of, oh wow, I really want to explore the play of this again and again and again, which is why it kind of sucks that there's so many of them, sometimes on interesting topics. But I'm kind of left with, geez, it's still the same game every time, and it's not really teaching me anything new. It's really an abstracted game. This one, I feel like, although there's that barrier of learning how to achieve those midterm goals or whatever, and how to make things happen in it, that's kind of difficult, and that you spend a lot of time thinking about and trying to figure out how you're going to do it. Still, more like the High Frontier situation, it leaves you with a desire to keep wanting to try, and I would probably be willing to give it, another shot. Opposed, certainly, but yeah, it's very difficult for me to. It's difficult for me to say, oh yeah, I'm not going to move on and play other games because I feel like I have such a duty to them that, just because this is my new flame or whatever, it's not gonna catch me in that way. My sense of duty is too high. One thing I wanted to talk about that I kind of got left behind, that clever little stability system. And I know I mentioned this earlier. I would compare it to Le Grand Guerres. This is one where you have a lot of input into it. You can push your flag. Maybe not if you're France or Italy and you don't have many flags running. But you can push your flags to keep your stability up. And you can improve your chances of keeping it up. In Le Grand Guerre, it just dissolves, right? And hits something, and then you basically face collapse as it is in here again and again in that game. Now, I think that's awesome and cool, but like most of the things in this game, you have a lot more capacity to control your destiny, even though there's a lot of randomness going on. And I think that's kind of an interesting point about it. Anyway, if you want to play a World War II, but probably nothing quite like the one that's in the history books. And not because the game is, unbelievably ahistorical, but rather because the game is designed to go off the rails and to provide you with possible situations that would have arisen from that origin. And of course, the smaller the scenario, the less likely you're going to have that much chaos in it. If you're willing to play a World War II, this is a really interesting game. I don't know how it compares. There's a couple of newer games that have come out. Quartermaster General, obviously, much lighter. And with Blitz, which to me looked like Days of Decision redone to make it somewhat interesting as a standalone game. Neither one, caught me. The Quartermaster General just looked too light and not grounded well enough. I heard things about Italy conquering large parts of the world, and here I'm just like, well, Italy is still Italy. France is still France. They're not powerhouses. They can do more than they did, but they're not going to become mega powers through the mechanisms of the game in the time period. One thing that I definitely miss with Days of Decision compared to this is that's more flexible, potentially, it's an optional role, in the grand strategic alliances. Yes, you have the possibility that the communists and the Axis will work together against the Allies, or that, whatever, that the Allies go into the Soviets as they did in my game or whatever. But what you don't have is the possibility through game mechanisms that countries change their base ideology. And honestly, that was not that unreasonable a thing to see as a possibility. It would not be unreasonable to see France going fascist. Their government was so weak that they might have still fallen into that. But would that fascist France have aligned with Germany on a guarantee? Or is it more likely that they would maybe try to swing something else? Maybe a Franco-Italian alliance against Germany. Who knows? But that flexibility isn't here. You can play the Francis fascist scenario, but it puts you in a fixed position. What you can't do is watch, and I mean America. America could have gone, as it seems to be now, towards a more fascist type of government than, there was Huey Long was a possibility. MacArthur was a possibility, actually. There were potentials for every one of the countries to change its ideological bent. Hitler could have failed within the time span of this game. Mussolini, I think he was pretty damn sturdy in his position up until the war started. Likewise, Stalin, pretty hard to see counter-revolution taking easy effect there. But it would be neat to have that kind of stuff. That's not in this. There's no real ability to play around with that side of things. But again, you know, it does what it does, and I think it does it in a very, very interesting way. And pretty damn glad to have it. All right, let's send it up.